All right. Again, welcome to Urban Faith. We are so glad with us today to have Linsey Davis. She is an amazing Emmy Award-winning news anchor, a mother, and a children's book author. And so we are so glad to talk about her book today, Stay This Way Forever. Here you go. And it is an opportunity just to talk about this book and how it's impacting children and some of her process. And so we're so glad to have you with us today, Linsey.
Thank you for having me, Alan. Thank
Absolutely.
you.
So my first question for you is, what inspired you to write a children's book after all of the work that you've done in journalism and news and being successful there? What got you interested in writing a book like this?
Well, Alan, like you, I have a 7-year-old, and when shortly after he was born, we were reading children's books to him, and I started thinking, I could do this, and ultimately that could turned into should, because I started thinking about how intentional and deliberate I had to be to find books with characters who look like my son. And so, a lot of times people think that it's such a departure from the news industry to writing children's books, and I guess by and large it is, except that at my core, I really consider myself to be a storyteller. And so it's really kind of more the same, except that I get to really tell the good news and focus on, positivity, and kind of let my creative juices flow in this way where, kind of my day job is often doom and gloom. So this was kind of a nice release. And additionally, I felt, my son wanted to watch me on TV quite often with the news. And I just feel like the themes and the storylines are just too heavy, really, for his young mind, and to try to preserve his innocence as much as I can. And so with the book writing, this was something that I could 100% share with him, that he could really be a part of the process, and ultimately, read the books together, and I could kind of guide the inspiration and what was going in, to his mind, the things that I wanted to instill in him.
That makes so much sense. As a father, I've got 3 daughters, 7, 5 months. I've got a baby, and I've got an 11-year-old, and just the importance of trying to find ways to shape them in positive ways. I really relate to that. And one of the things you mentioned really sticks out. I want to ask you, there's a lot about creativity there in the beginning of the book, and imagination, and trying to encourage that. What are some of the ways that imagination and creativity play a role for you in the work that you do, or even in writing this?
I think just being an effective storyteller is all about creative writing and using the language in the most expressive way. A lot of the creativity that I was talking about in the book, at least with my own son, he loves Legos. And so he likes to kind of create. So we'll get him a set that's intended to be one thing, and he takes the head from that and the wings from this other thing, and, comes up with his own creation. And I love that, the idea of, thinking outside of the box, where I think that quite often as we become adults, we get more kind of pigeonholed into a certain way of thinking, where for kids, they just are starting from the ground up as far as whatever they can dream, they can kind of create and build. Though I have started being more intentional with my son, and he just got a journal. He had been asking me, what a diary is, and so I said, would you like to, kind of write your thoughts down? And so he said yes. And I think that writing is just such a key way for us to express ourselves, whether we're young or old, or just hoping to kind of remember and hold on to certain moments that we're going to really kind of forget decades from now. We can go back and relive some of those moments and think about how we process them at the time.
So that actually gives me a really great segue to another question that I had. I felt like when I was reading this book, I was capturing feelings from raising my girls, from being a child myself. And you did such a good job capturing feelings and memories.
Oh, thank you.
Absolutely. Were there any particular moments that came to mind for you, or some of those memories or feelings that stuck out as you were writing this?
So I have a journal, but I do a terrible job at actually keeping up and regularly doing entries. So I treated this book as, every mom and dad's kind of thoughts with regard to childhood, and really kind of trying to press the pause button or freeze these moments before they all slip away. And so, yes, in particular, the pitter patter of my son's feet in the morning before he jumps into bed with us, especially on the weekends. I've thought so many times, I'm going to miss this one day when he no longer, wants to jump in bed with mom and dad. And so many of the aspects of childhood, I think you never know when it's going to be the last time. So when they're going to cuddle up in your lap and fall asleep, or reach for your hand, when you're walking along, I think sometimes they become, too cool, or they're ready to go off with their friends. But for right now, I'm really cherishing this time. And I think that so many parents will really be able to relate, and it'll kind of resonate with them about this intimacy and this shared time. Additionally, when my son was falling asleep, that's kind of what I would do. I would keep my phone with me while the lights were out, and he'd want somebody to be in the room. And I would try and write down different ideas of the day that I just really wanted to keep with me. And one of those nights, he said, you know what I'm going to do tomorrow? And he was telling me about how he was going to have certain ice cream, and he was going to have this play date. And he said, it's going to be the best day ever. And I love that idea. And I really hope that no matter if he's 30 or 50 or 70, the idea that tomorrow is still so pregnant with possibility, and to be excited about tomorrow. I think that when we stop being excited about the future, is a detriment for us. And so I'm hoping, and there's so many of these things that, his curiosity, his creativity, his excitement, these are the aspects of childhood that I think that he can take with him into adulthood, that he doesn't have to, kind of put away childish things at some point when he becomes a man. I think that in those ways, I hope that he'll take those with him.
So you're so capturing just that tension of letting your child grow up, and at the same time instilling those values that they have in childhood. You've mentioned that a few times. I want to know, as you're speaking to parents and as you're doing this kind of work with children's books, what are some ways, or some different ways to think about how we can help our children to mature, but at the same time hold on to some of those childlike characteristics, or those enduring characteristics?
I often think about the concept of the helicopter mom, right? And I try to not be that. I remember a distinct moment when my son he was probably one, and wasn't, or was just kind of getting the hang of walking. And he was moving from ultimately the crib to the bed, but there was a bed already set up in his room, and it was very high. And so he was doing his best to get up on top of the bed, right? So, but he couldn't really get there on his own. But then he started really maneuvering and figuring out, well, if I pull this blanket this way and I throw my leg up this way. And so I just watched the process, and I figured I could pick him up and easily just plop him on top of the bed, but let me have him figure this out, right? And I think that in some ways we can be there to watch, to try to help elevate when it's necessary. But I think other than that, it's also part of our responsibility to let our kids kind of figure it out a little bit, and let them kind of clean up their own mess sometimes, within reason. And I think that that's a delicate dance and a balance that in the moment as parents, we have to kind of figure out. Sometimes it's easier to just, you want to just kind of pick them up and put them on top of the bed. But I think that there is, a victory and struggle for like a larger theme of life, really, and knowing when to kind of let them, figure it out on their own.
Absolutely. And one of the other things that you mentioned is just everything that's going on in the world. Now we've got kids who have just lived through a pandemic, right? Who have lived through all of this unrest, and there's uncertainty. And I hear my daughter asking, why is this happening? What are we supposed to do? What are some ways that you can just encourage your son, or can help other parents to encourage their kids as they're seeing some of this stuff, or even hearing about it, whether it's in class or elsewhere? How can we keep encouraging our kids?
Well, if you look at studies, kids are so resilient, right? And so I think that in some ways, while this has been hard, I think on every different, age range, I think that the kids are going to be the ones that really snap back, the fastest. And that gives me hope. And so, in our household, we really try to to be hopeful about the different phases of what we're going through. And, it was my son's birthday at the end of March, right as like everything started shutting down in New York. And so, we were supposed to go to Disney for the first time and plan the trip. And then, we were thinking, well, things are going to be better in September. So we replanned the trip for then, but then, things were not better at all. But it's been about really focusing on the positives through it. So we've talked about how we've gotten to have breakfast and lunch together as a family for almost a year, and we were able to really have this quality time that otherwise we wouldn't have, because my son would be at school and then I go to work at a later shift. And so we really would only see each other on the weekends. And so this has given us this, renewed family time. And I think that there are ways in the midst of the toughest of times to find something that kind of sparkles a little bit in the midst of it. And so we've really tried to hold on to that and really be intentional about counting our blessings. Because we know that, there are people who do have, those empty chairs at the tables. And so we talked to our son about that, and both, the good and the bad, and what we have to still be so thankful for and so grateful. And that's the journal that we just got my son is a gratitude journal. And again, a very intentional way to try to focus on the positives.
I love that idea of just gratitude journaling, and just taking that time to be thankful, for little things. What are some of the ways that you have helped yourself to deal with everything that's going on and to remain in that place of thankfulness, especially as you're doing really tough work, but also trying to be a positive force in your household? I kept seeing those pictures of the family together, of, just spending those moments. How have you navigated that?
There is a saying often where people will talk about praying and moving your feet, right? Which in the original context and meaning of it, it's about, being prayerful, but also then kind of taking some action right behind that prayer. But I'm looking at it for this particular moment of the pandemic in a separate way. I've been praying and moving my feet, and that I have been prayerful. But at the same time, I've been running a lot. And so I have kind of used that time to be mindful, to exercise, in a mind and body kind of way. And, sometimes it was really intense because we were homeschooling and still working and trying to figure out, because initially there was no Zoom or there was no lesson plan. I was trying to kind of come up with an experiment and then make lunch, by the way, and then go out and prepare for work. And so it was a lot. And so I did find it really necessary to kind of carve out that me time, which often would be, in running. And also I've really started being more deliberate about, reading like daily inspiration, daily meditation, 1 year Bible, and really kind of turning to that, not in a desperation kind of way, but just like a really leaning in, like, okay, I'm listening, and let me kind of trying to get some wisdom in the midst of all this.
Yeah, those daily devotions are just, they can be huge. And that's something
Yes.
I'm leaning into and we're trying to do more of. But something that I think inspired you, that you talked about at the beginning, was just the lack of images and that need for being able to allow your son to see characters that look like him and stories that sounded like, what he's growing up around. Why is it important for us to have books like this that speak to children in their context, especially as African Americans? Why are a book like yours important?
Sure. There was an essay that I read years ago, and it was called Windows, Mirrors, and Sliding Glass Doors. And the point was that every children's book, for it to really be effective, it needs to have a mirror so that the child can see themselves reflected in the pages. It needs to have a window so a child can peer into a world that's perhaps unfamiliar to their own. And if that window is to really be transformative, it can serve as a way to transport them into that world that may be unfamiliar. So initially I was writing this thinking, I need to have Black and brown characters for my son, so he sees himself. I was really only thinking about the mirror of it. But then as I started kind of having this shift where I was seeing just as important the need to have the windows, because in this climate that we still continue to be in, even in the midst of this so-called racial reckoning, and there's been so much talk about, how we're different. And I think that, people will often say that kids don't see color. I totally disagree with that. Kids do see color. They just don't assign a value to it. It's adults who do that. It's learned behavior, that children get from often their parents and their environment, people they're around. And so I think that it's just as important that I provide those windows for parents. I think that, in many scenarios, parents really need to examine their own bookshelves and see how diverse their book collection is. And if you live in an area that doesn't have a lot of diversity, or their school, your place of worship is not diverse, I always recommend to parents that they start with their toys and their books, because that's an easy way that you can expose your children and give them that kind of experience to a child who doesn't necessarily look like them. And quite often we fear what we don't know. And so the more that you just have kind of a sense of, oh, yes, I've seen people who are that color before. I've seen people who have that belief before, or that religion, or whatever it is. Because, quite often kids will say, like my son, if he goes to school or camp or something, when he comes home and has met a new friend, he tells me immediately what they have in common. They like Legos just like I do. They like Star Wars just like I do. We ate popsicles together. And adults will often think of, how we're different from each other, but kids just are looking at, how we're alike. And that's why I wrote my second book, which was One Big Heart, a celebration of being more alike than different, because I felt like, okay, let's just confront it. Yes, our hair is different, our skin is different, our features are different, our beliefs are different. But in the end, God gave us one big heart. And that's the most important part, because that's where love starts. And so I think that it's a kind of a continuation through all three of my books that, it's very deliberate that on at least one or two of the spreads in each of my books, you're going to have a group setting. So they're going to be at a school, in a classroom, or in an airport, or a block party where you have a lot of different people. And so anybody who's looking at the pages of these books or reading them, they're going to see somebody who they can identify with, who looks like them, or a family member or relative, because I think it's so important for, when people talk about like diversity and inclusion, I think that they're not necessarily looking at the big picture unless you're including everybody, right? It's not just about bringing only Black and brown people to the table. It's about bringing Native Americans and Asians, right? And if you look at, historically, this is going back several years, and I haven't been able to find new data. But when I was looking 7 years ago, it was that more than 90% of the children's protagonists in children's books were white. And meanwhile, if you look at the US Census Bureau, half of the kids in this country are kids of color. And so additionally, there was a study in 2018 out of the University of Wisconsin that found that 27% of children's books have animals as the central character. And so that means that children are more likely to see an animal in their books than they are children of color. And so that's really a problem. And so rather than complain about it, I figured, let me just be part of the solution and start creating some books that have Black and brown characters.
Wow, that's striking data, just to even think about the fact that it's harder to find ourselves in books, or to find kids that look like you for Black and brown kids. That's really striking, and I appreciate you being part of that solution already. You also mentioned just how faith is helping you to stay grounded and motivated. What are some ways that faith can continue to be used to help instill that hope and that creativity and that positivity that you've placed in this book?
Well, I think that it really has to be, it's something that as a parent, I think that you're conscious of, right? If that's something that you want to pass along to your children. My first book, The World is Awake, a celebration of everyday blessings, was my thought to, give my son and other children this kind of gentle introduction to who God is, the world around us, and us, his creations of us, and the bumblebees and the sunsets and the butterflies, and all of that. And when I have the opportunity to drop my son off at school, I pray over him while we're walking. I'm talking about, God, help us to be kind, help us to be better disciples, keep us safe, keep us healthy, and I do it out loud in a very casual way so that he's mindful of that and he's picking that up. Because, when I look at my own upbringing and what my parents, the gift that my parents gave me, outside of life was, introducing me to God and encouraging me to have a relationship with God. And so that is something that I see as really part of when we're talking about positivity, right? When we're talking about being optimistic and hopeful, for me, that is where I go for that kind of to be uplifted. And I want my son to be able to have that same know-how and access and knowledge and relationship with God.
It's great. So pivoting just to what it is, the message that you wanted to communicate to children reading this book. Like I said, my daughter has just started reading in the past couple of years. She's trying to grasp some of these words, but she looked at your book and she knew, she said, stay this way forever. She could read that out loud, and that stuck out to her right away. What are some of the messages that you would want to pass on to kids who are reading this, who may be new readers or, even hearing their parents read?
I think that that's where it'll be really profound, is to hear your parents or grandparents reading these words, just to know that you're loved and to know that you're cherished and to know also very specifically why. I think that there's something really special and meaningful when somebody tells you, I love that, the way you smile, the way you throw your head back when you laugh, the very specifics of not why you love them, but the examples of the ways in which you love and the things, the qualities about them that you love in a very unconditional way. And so we go through the book with the very specific, aspects of children that, again, I think that everybody's going to relate to, like the belly laughs or the tickle fights or whatever it is that you do in your home. Chances are a lot of families are doing the same thing, just going through these different, stages of childhood. And so I think that's the main aspect, is I hope that the children who are reading this or being read to, that they just feel cherished and adored by their loved ones.
You have a line in there that really touched me, that your heart would stay open wide so that love can rush in. And can you just talk a little bit about what that may mean, how we can stay open, or what you meant as you were writing that?
Sure. Well, I think that it's anyone. I don't even think it's just having a Black son, but I do worry about how, when he gets older, how he could become guarded based on the world's perceptions of him just because of his skin color. And I really don't want that for him. I really don't want to have the albatross kind of around his neck and that weightiness that can come along with that. And so I'm really hoping that he'll still love so freely, and that he won't feel that he's been, boxed in. But I think that any parent, again, can relate to that, whether it's bullies, whether it's, for whatever it could be that we could be ostracized about in our community, in a way that we feel that, we don't measure up, or people kind of keep us distant, or that they're not going to be friends with us for whatever reason it could be. Kids have, unfortunately, so many reasons that they end up kind of guarded and boxing themselves off from the hurt or the pain. And so I really am just hoping, for as long as he can, that he can really preserve, and children in general can hold on to that idea of just loving. It's kind of like, when people talk about, dancing like no one's watching and that kind of thing, just, that freedom, that unbridled, just, excitement and wide-eyed, love of life and joy. That is what I'm really, talking about in that line, that sense of just loving and being loved and giving it in exchange very easily, very in a very fluid way.
So this is my last question. I really appreciated this, just being able to read it. I honestly started to tear up when I got to the end.
Oh, that's so
Just
sweet.
it's a beautiful book, and I'm so glad that you wrote it and I'm able to share it, with my daughters. What's something that you want to leave readers with parents with, as they're thinking about how to help their children maintain these qualities of openness to life and love?
I think that, first of all, just spending quality time with our children, and even in the midst of, this turbulent past year, I have tried to be like really intentional about going out on dates with my son, just taking him, just the two of us to lunch, and really trying to put the phone down during that time and just talking to him about what he's thinking and what he's feeling. And I think that whatever it is that we can do, if it's that reading time right before bedtime or prayer time or the meal time, whatever it is, the time that we're able to, kind of set aside. Again, I think just in the same way that kids are resilient, I think that they're going to remember, even though you're maybe busy, you're going off to work, or you've got a busy, hectic schedule on Zoom calls all day. I think that they will be very forgiving if they know that, but at the end of the night, you were there to tuck me in. At the end of the day, you were there, at dinner time, and you kind of talked me through my day or whatever it is. I would like to think, maybe I'm being too optimistic, but I do think that with my own childhood, I think you're willing to kind of let a lot of things ride if you felt fulfilled at the end of the day, you know? And I think that quite often many parents would be surprised on just how little bit of us, just that little bit can go a long way in the heart and eyes of a child.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for this. Again, I'm touched to stay this way forever and share that with my daughters. My 5-month-old loved the pictures. She tried to eat
Oh,
it, so I
nice.
couldn't let
Oh.
her. But it's just a joy. And I thank you so much, Linsey, for sharing with us today, and just look forward to continuing these conversations with our children and our audience.
Alan, thank you so much for your time and having me on today.
Absolutely. Take care.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.